Bright headlights pierced a heavy layer of snowflakes. A scientist walks through the sleet, wrapped as warmly as possible. Two other guys, dressed in identical black cold-weather outfits, approach the scientist. He brings them to an excavation site the size of a football field, with a massive wing and fuselage visible in the center. The guys in black sliced through the fuselage of the mysterious craft and entered. They discover the wreckage of a gigantic, frozen spacecraft within. When one of the soldiers wipes away the snow, he notices a gleaming red, white, and blue shield encased in ice. Norway, Tunsberg, 1942. As their village is overtaken by Nazis, two custodians for an old Viking ruin listen. Suddenly, the front door bursts wide, letting in a swarm of Nazi operatives. One of the caregivers is killed in the explosion, and the other begs the troops to leave him alone. They ignore the old guy and proceed to unlock the building's crypts one by one. They arrive upon a sarcophagus with a lid that is too hefty to raise. In the exploded entrance, a shadowy figure appears. Johann Schmidt, a high-ranking Nazi and the leader of the Hydra group, comes casually. He walks across the room to the difficult-to-open tomb and effortlessly pushes the lid open. He discovers the skeleton bones of an elderly Viking clutching a glass cube within. Schmidt is begged to leave by the caretaker. Schmidt scoffs, claiming that if this cube weren't a forgery, it would be the crown treasure of Odin's treasury. He crushes it on the floor and asks the caretaker where the actual cube is. The caretaker first refuses, but when threatened with damage to his family, he relents. Motioning to a concealed drawer across the room, which is part of an old sculpture the size of the wall, Schmidt pries the drawer apart to reveal the genuine, illuminating cube hidden within. Schmidt tells his soldiers to bomb the city before shooting the unfortunate caretaker. Steve Rogers, a 20-something asthmatic weighing 90 pounds and standing 5 feet tall, is anxiously awaiting the opportunity to register in the United States Army at a recruitment facility in Brooklyn. The Army doctor examines Steve's medical dossier, which reads like that of a 90-year-old man, and rejects Steve's application as the military 4F, as this is his fourth unsuccessful enlistment attempt. Steve goes to the movies. He envies the enlisted guys depicted in the pre-show newsreel and observes as other members of the crowd cry. A rowdy, impatient moviegoer starts shouting at the screen, "Begin the movie. I didn't pay to witness this nonsense." When Steve orders the man to stop talking, the man turns around, gets up, and towers over him. The bully violently beats the tiny Steve in the alley behind the theater, who courageously fights back but is soon defeated. When his opponent questions why he isn't just giving up, the bleeding Steve responds, "I can do this all day." Steve's best buddy, James "Bucky" Barnes, rushes to the alley. He quickly kicks the bully away and attends to Steve, who is irritated that Bucky arrived and took rid of the bully just as Steve was regaining his strength. Bucky has been enlisted, his application was approved, and he was sent to the 107th Infantry Division. Bucky asks Steve to go dancing with a couple of females on a double date in a joyous atmosphere. Steve reluctantly follows. The four travel to Queens for the World's Fair. While Bucky canoodles with his dates, Steve observes Playboy inventor Howard Stark's failed demonstration of a flying automobile. Steve leaves the group to visit another recruitment station. Bucky approaches him and inquires as to how Steve intends to fabricate his application this time. Dr. Abraham Erskine, who happens to be walking by, overhears their chat. He is captivated by Steve's audacity. Bucky bids Steve luck with his current application, and Steve enters the recruiting station for his fifth physical. Inside, Steve sits on an examination table, growing apprehensive as an MP and Dr. Erskine approach the room. All of Steve's previous applications are on file with Dr. Erskine. Concerned about Steve's unsuccessful applications, Erskine puts his character to the test by asking if his desire to kill Nazis drives his determination on seeking for military service. The young guy truly admits that he is not a murderer at heart, but that he dislikes bullies, of any provenance. He also displays no worry when Erskine discloses that he is German by birth. Erskine approves Steve's newest application after being won over by his strong resolve and persistent belief. Johann Schmidt delivers the glowing cube to Dr. Arnim Zola, his Hydra weapon specialist, at a secret military station high in the Alps. Schmidt and Dr. Zola are able to power unstoppable energy weapons and cannons because to the cube's seemingly endless power. Meanwhile, Steve has been recruited in basic training. where he will be closely monitored by Dr. Erskine and Colonel Chester Phillips. He and his battalion are informed that they are eligible for the government's newest super soldier program. Phillips is dissatisfied with Steve and is irritated by Dr. Erskine's interest in him. During basic training, Steve encounters Peggy Carter, a gorgeous but determined British officer who appears to pity him, despite being the smallest and weakest member of the platoon. Steve demonstrates the most spirit, selflessness, and ingenuity, particularly when his platoon is tasked with retrieving a flag from the top of a tall pole, as the other, more fit men in the company fail the task one by one as they try to climb the pole. Steve casually pulls the pin holding it up, taking the flag when the pole crashes to the ground. Phillips, still skeptical, throws a grenade into the group during exercises, scattering them all. Phillips is taken aback when Steve dives on top of it alone, eager to sacrifice himself to save the others, only to learn that the grenade was a fake. Erskine's judgment is accepted by Phillips. Dr. Erskine speaks with Steve that evening. Dr. Erskine explains that this is not his first time doing this experiment over a bottle of schnapps. He narrates a narrative about Johann Schmidt ordering him to make a serum that would give a man godlike power prior to his departure to the United States. Dr. Erskine developed a preliminary version of the serum he wants to use on Steve, but when Schmidt injected himself, his flesh rusted away, leaving him as a sinewy crimson skeleton. Despite the danger, Steve decided to go forward with the treatment. The next morning, Steve and Peggy drive across Brooklyn, stopping in front of an old antique shop. Steve points off numerous locations of Brooklyn where he's been beaten up along the road. She inquires as to why he has never fled. He adds that fleeing was, in his opinion, an invitation to more assault. The two enter the antique shop, swap passcodes with an elderly woman working the register, and descend into a hidden military bunker. Peggy leads Steve to the center of the bunker, where they discover Dr. Erskine and Howard Stark constructing a medical capsule, and Colonel Phillips rubbing shoulders with senators and dignitaries. Steve is instructed to remove his shirt and sit in the capsule. According to Stark, the process will begin with the injection of muscle regenerators into Roger's primary muscle groups, which will then be assaulted with Vita rays. Erskine has made no secret of Steve's suffering, but he assures he'll emerge stronger. Carter wishes Steve well before joining Phillips in the overhead viewing room. Steve is encased within the Vita ray capsule after Erskine's serum is infused into his muscles. The capsule shines brilliantly. Steve shouts in pain but encourages them to keep going, and the treatment is finished fast. When the capsule is turned off, Steve emerges a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier, with substantial muscle. Yet these are only the most superficial features of his physique that have been artificially boosted to human potential. Everyone, including Phillips, rejoices at the procedure's success and descends from the viewing chamber to congratulate Erskine. A lone dignitary, Heinz Kruger, a German spy, remains behind, placing a little bag on a chair. The watching gallery erupts moments later. Dr. Erskine is fatally shot twice by Kruger as he descends the stairs. He quickly murders the guards and runs into the streets, with Peggy hot on his tail. Steve attends to Dr. Erskine, who has just enough energy to point at Steve's heart before passing away. Steve flees the bunker in pursuit of Kruger. Peggy chases Kruger down the street and easily kills his getaway driver. Kruger grabs a cab and plans to run Peggy over. Steve arrives just in time to save her from being hit by an incoming taxi. Steve chases the cab on foot, sprinting faster than a normal human, and without the tiredness that a healthy guy would experience. He hops onto the roof of the cab, dodges Kruger's bullets, and the two crash land in the Brooklyn docks. Kruger fires at Steve, who is shielded by the star-imprinted door of the destroyed taxi. Kruger runs to his Hydra submarine, which dives beneath as Steve approaches. Steve follows the sub, smashes a hole in the cockpit glass, and pulls Kruger to the surface. Kruger informs Steve that he is the first of many, that Rogers can cut off one head, but two more will replace it. He then murders himself with a cyanide pill secreted in a false tooth, exclaiming one final "Heil Hydra," before passing out. Meanwhile, Schmidt and Dr. Zola are visited by three of Hitler's senior officers, who have been assigned to inspect Schmidt's operation. They mock Schmidt, claiming that the Nazi Party no longer takes him and Hydra seriously because of his fixation with magic and the occult, and they jokingly refer to him as the Red Skull, a moniker Schmidt despises. Schmidt brings the three to his weapons laboratory, where they see his unstoppable energy weapons and a strategic map of Europe peppered with targets. One of the three spots a target above Berlin and confronts Schmidt. Schmidt vaporizes the three Nazi officers in a flash. Schmidt declares that Hydra has left the Nazi party and is now at odds with the rest of the globe. Phillips and Carter pick up the remains of Dr. Erskine's lab the next day. Both are depressed since Erskine is the only one capable of making the serum. Steve wants to go to the front lines in Europe, but Phillips would rather have him as a lab rat than a soldier in his army. A senator approaches Steve, holding a newspaper featuring a front-page photo of Steve chasing after Heinz Kruger from the previous day's events. Steve has become an overnight superstar, and the senator has a mutually advantageous proposition. Steve joins the USO, United Service Organizations, and travels across the Midwest advocating war bonds and performing musical numbers while dressed in a shabby red, white, and blue costume and carrying a triangle-shaped shield depicting the stars and stripes. He adopts the alias, Captain America, and the program includes a theme song made especially for him, Dancing Girls, and a short scene in which he punches out Hitler. Performed by an actor, Captain America becomes an instant blockbuster. Generating comic books and black and white films, his antics generate funds for the USO. Steve is shortly sent to Italy to continue entertaining the troops. When he arrives, the grumpy and war-torn men ridicule him and advise him to go find himself. He is shortly greeted by Carter, who, together with Phillips, is in charge of the war's European theater. She informs him that the troops are dissatisfied since numerous members of their division, the 107th Infantry, have been killed in action. Steve understands this is Bucky's section and rushes to meet Phillips. Phillips cannot locate Bucky's name on his casualty list and advises Steve to return to his work as a movie star and cheerleader. Steve inquires of Carter as to where the guys and Bucky are being detained. She shows him a map and the location of a known Hydra weapons plant 30 to 40 kilometers behind enemy lines. Over his Captain America outfit, Steve quickly puts on a set of army trousers and a leather jacket, as well as a blue helmet with a white A imprinted on the front. He intends to take a vehicle and drive inside Hydra's domain, but she has a better plan. In his own jet, Howard Stark takes them both over the battlefield. Steve suspects Stark and Carter are in a relationship and hides his affections for her. As Hydra anti-aircraft guns fire on Stark's jet, Steve parachutes in, while the other two flee to safety. Steve sneaks into the Hydra stronghold, slaying multiple guards in the process. Inside, Schmidt and Zola are creating enough weaponry to destroy every capital on the planet. Steve makes his way to the holding cells, where he sees hundreds of 107th inmates. He sets the guys free and instructs them to make a messy escape. The captives, led by the Howling Commandos, defeat their keepers, take firearms and tanks, and flee the facility, destroying most of it. Schmidt observes Steve through CCTV and instantly concludes that he is Erskine's guy. He rapidly detonates multiple explosive charges, leveling the base. Steve makes his way through the building and comes upon Bucky, who is bound to an operation table and clearly tormented. Steve also discovers a large tactical map on the wall, which is marked with numerous installations. Steve releases Bucky, who is astonished to learn that Steve is taller than him, and memorizes the map. The two go up the catwalks and come face to face with Schmidt on a retractable bridge. Rogers hits Schmidt, who, surprise, defends himself. Schmidt plays with his face, which appears to have come loose from his skull, and swiftly rips it away as a mask. The Red Skull returns Rogers and Bucky's glare before entering an elevator. The Red Skull instructs Arnim Zola in the elevator to meet him at another Hydra base and steal his automobile. The Red Skull flees the collapsing complex in an unusually constructed private jet, while Zola flees in Schmidt's roadster. Inside, Steve and Bucky face a major barrier to their escape. Bucky traverses a shaky, buckling support beam and makes it to safety just as the beam falls into the inferno below. Steve, having no other choice, backs up as far as he can and leaps across the blazing gap. Back at the 107th base camp, Phillips drafts a note to his typist about Rogers' disappearance the night before and likely death during the combat. Phillips then chastises Agent Carter for creating this loss, noting that, unlike the essential Stark, she may be punished. Carter tries to defend her actions, but Phillips dismisses them outright, claiming that the loss of Rogers, the sole successful test subject of Project Rebirth, would be sufficient enough to shut down their company. Just before Rogers arrives, over 400 survivors of the 107th leave the facility in a frenzy, carrying samples of the Red Skull's technology, including several assault vehicles. Rogers reports to Phillips for disciplinary punishment for going out in direct violation of rules, but is excused. Bucky asks for a standing ovation for Rogers, who has really become Captain America. The word of Captain America's victory on the battlefield has spread throughout the world, but Rogers does not appear in Congress to get his medal. The reason for Steve's absence is in London, where he provides Phillips and Carter his best recall of the Hydra base map and informs them that he plans to go to those bases and destroy them one by one, and that he desires to organize a squad of soldiers from those he rescued in Italy. In a pub, Steve encounters the Howling Commandos, who excitedly embrace his offer. All of the males are taken aback when Peggy walks in wearing a form-fitting cocktail dress. She ignores all the males, including Bucky, and flirts with Steve, saying she'd love to dance with him someday. The following day, Steve is called to the Brooklyn bunker to meet with Phillips and Stark. A gorgeous female cop approaches Steve and expresses her gratitude for his service in the greatest way she knows how. Peggy comes in on Steve kissing the enlisted lady and rushes away in rage. Steve follows her to Stark's lab sheepishly, explaining that he gets anxious around women and asking why he should apologize if Carter and Stark are having a thing. Stark instantly dismisses the supposed romance and summons Steve to his weapons engineering lab. He observes Rogers' attachment to the triangular shield, which Steve describes as a useful tool in the field. Several prototype shields with complicated components are on a table, but Steve discovers a basic, round shield on a lower shelf. Stark says that the shield is constructed of vibranium, a metal that is lighter than steel, vibration resistant, and can withstand large hits. He asks Peggy for his opinion while holding the shield in front of him. She mockingly shoots a .45 pistol clip at the shield, which Steve hides behind. The shield performs wonderfully in the impromptu test. As she goes away, Steve hands Stark a drawing of a uniform. Steve dons red, white, and blue fatigues, a blue form-fitting helmet, and carries the newly colored shield on his back. Captain America and his men, including Bucky, travel throughout Europe, crushing Hydra's outposts one by one, with Rogers becoming fairly adept at utilizing the shield as a projectile weapon and learning that it can ricochet off numerous surfaces without losing any velocity. The Red Skull and Zola learn about his deeds. The Skull is enraged, referring to Rogers as a simpleton with a shield, and murdering the last guy alive in one of his demolished sites. Steve and his guys are on a mission in the Alps to catch Zola on his personal train. Cap, Bucky, and Gabe Jones of the crew zipline across a large abyss and storm the train car by car. Cap and Bucky are soon surrounded by highly armed Hydra troops. Although they narrowly overcome the troops, Bucky is thrown off the train and falls into an ice river below. Zola has been arrested. Colonel Phillips pays Zola a visit in his jail cell and brings him a steak meal. Zola refuses the food, thinking that it is tainted. Phillips shrugs and consumes it. He informs Zola that he sent out a readily decipherable communication, which was undoubtedly intercepted by Hydra, stating that Zola had defected. He also knows Zola is easy to deal with because he's the only Hydra agent they've apprehended who hasn't swallowed his cyanide pill in order to avoid giving information, fearing that the deception may lead to his execution at the hands of the Red Skull. Zola caves into Phillips and informs him the location of the Red Skull's last surviving Hydra outpost. Rogers mopes at a war-torn tavern. Carter arrives and consoles Steve on the death of his closest buddy. Steve finds that Dr. Erskine's serum rapidly regrows dead cells, rendering him incapable of getting inebriated. Rogers and his squad devise a strategy to eliminate Red Skull at his headquarters. Rogers mounts a Harley and assaults the base. Clad in a new uniform, he quickly avoids Hydra soldiers and tanks and arrives at the base. Surrounded by a Hydra force, he is apprehended and led to the Red Skull's private weapons lab. Red Skull wonders what makes Steve so unique. "Nothing, I'm just a kid from Brooklyn," Steve adds as members of his crew dash inside Red Skull's office. A massive combat erupts as hundreds of soldiers led by Phillips and Carter attack the facility, killing several Hydra soldiers. Red Skull runs to his own hangar, where a massive flying wing powered by the Tesseract is about to take flight. Steve tries to catch up to the jet on foot but fails. Phillips and Carter arrive in the Skull's roadster, and the three of them pursue the plane. Peggy stops Steve and kisses him just as he is ready to jump into the jet. Steve leaps from the roadster onto one of the big wheels of the jet. He climbs onto the ship and discovers hundreds of kamikaze planes/missiles, each tagged with a major American city. Soon after, Hydra troops enter the area, and Steve fights them, taking down multiple men and miniature planes. One of the planes, branded New York, is released. Steve chases it down, capturing it and crashing it back into the flying wing after tossing the pilot through its rearward-mounted propeller. Captain America and Red Skull are fighting inside the big cockpit. Red Skull fires his cube energy weapon at Steve, who deflects the rounds effortlessly with his shield. One of the shots gets deflected into one of the cockpit's center consoles, which houses the luminous blue cube. Skull pulls the cube into the air after the console is damaged. Suddenly, a doorway above him opens, revealing starry space. The Red Skull glows brilliantly and appears to be disintegrating. His ashes had been whisked up into the universe. The cube falls to the ground, still shining brilliantly, and burns its way down through the plane's hull before crashing into the water below. Steve controls the plane and communicates with Carter through radio. He informs her that the jet is on a route that will take them to the East Coast. He informs her that their dance would have to be postponed. He causes the plane to descend and crash onto the glacier below. Peggy is just hearing static. Steve awakens in a hospital from the 1940s. A vintage radio broadcasts the play-by-play of a Brooklyn Dodgers game. He stands up, looks out the windows, and waits for the hospital entrance to open. A young nurse who looks exactly like Peggy walks in. She waits for Steve to respond, who stares at her warily. He wonders why the radio is playing a game from May 1941. A game he knows he attended. She digs into her pocket and pulls out a two-way radio. Steve easily tosses two large soldiers in black uniforms through a wall as they approach the room. Steve walks through the hole and discovers that the hospital is actually a movie set. He dashes through the dim halls, pulls open a door, and finds himself in a contemporary building packed with business suits. He leaves the building and ends up at Times Square in 2011. He looks around, taken aback by his circumstances, and watches as a ring of similar black SUVs encircles him. Nick Fury comes and speaks closely to Steve. He informs him that he has been dormant in ice for the past 70 years, in a state of suspended animation. The hospital set was intended to gradually acquaint him with modern life. Still baffled, Steve takes a deep breath and informs Fury that he has a date, as he realizes that everyone else he knew in the 1940s is either deceased or extremely elderly today. Steve is at an old-fashioned gym in a post-credit sequence. He slams a punching bag so hard that it falls off its chain and flies across the room. Fury walks into the gym and asks Steve if he's been having difficulty sleeping. Steve sarcastically inquires whether Fury has arrived with another assignment. Fury responds affirmatively.